I wanted to start by talking about a tradition here at Wose. It's been our tradition for the last 10, maybe 15 years that I have done the first historical tribute of the year, every year, and so this year, next year, that won't be happening. So I won't get a chance to celebrate the first tribute of the year. So today, what I want to do instead is celebrate this, my last tribute, or at least my last tribute of 2022. And I wanted to start with this picture. I wanted to say that I have loved doing the tributes here at Wose. I've loved doing the research. I've loved learning about whatever topic I chose to give. I love people's reaction when I gave what I thought was a good tribute. But mostly I loved telling the story. I love telling the story. For me, tributes has been about telling stories. And so I wanted to start with this picture to say that I haven't always been an old guy with the gray hair. That I used to be a young revolutionary minded, if not revolutionary. And even back in those days, I loved to tell the stories. And so I want to talk about the very first tribute that I ever gave. And I was introduced by Sister Keisha, who used to coordinate the historical tributes back then. And my first tribute was about a maroon settlement at Prospect Bluff, Florida, made up of escaped slaves and Native Americans. And they lived in a fort that was left to them by the British. And it was in Florida. It wasn't even a part of the United States, but the United States didn't want them there. So they sent the Army and the Navy down to remove them. And so the Army demanded that they surrender. And the brother who was in charge of the settlement, his name was Garcon, he took a vote of all the people that were in the fort. And to a person, they all said, no, we don't want to go back to slavery, So Brother Garcon answered with a cannon shot. And so the siege was on. And the people in the fort were able to hold their own. And they held off the Army for 10 days. But then the Navy started heating up its cannonballs and firing red hot cannonballs into the fort. One of those cannonballs hit where the Maroons stored their ammunition. And the resultant explosion destroyed the fort and killed over 270 people. Now, you might wonder why I chose such a loss of life for my first tribute, but I didn't see this as a loss. I think that God's will is that people be free. And I saw it as a courageous stand by our people to live God's will, and who chose freedom over slavery and who fought to the death rather than to go back to subjugation. So when I finished that tribute, I had prepared so much for that tribute that I didn't need any notes for it. And when I finished the tribute, Brother Crosby, James Crosby, who's an ancestor now, came running up to me, and he shook my hand, pumped my hand a lot, shook it, and said, the brother gave didn't use a single note. And that kind of inspired me, and that I was hooked, and that's why I've done tributes since I have. Another story that I told was of Araminta Ross. Now, she was a sister. Excuse me. She was a sister the story I told her, she was born into slavery, and she was hit in the head as a young girl and knocked unconscious, and suffered from blackouts for the rest of her life as a result of that. I told you how she escaped to the North, and how while she was free in the North, she couldn't enjoy her freedom if her family wasn't with her. And so she escaped back to the South. In fact, she escaped back 13 times and brought many enslaved people to freedom, including her parents. And of course, today, we know her as Harriet Tubman. Another story that I've told was of Brother Mose Wright. Mose Wright was a poor man who lived in Money, Mississippi. He was the first Black man in the history of Mississippi to stand up and point at a white man in court and say, "Thar he," in his broken English, "Thar he," when asked who took his nephew from his house at night. Of course, the two men that he pointed to got away with the brutal lynching that they did. Of course, his nephew was Emmett Till. And Emmett Till's lynching and the way his mother, Mamie Bradley, handled it, for many people, was the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. I also told a story about a brother whose name most of us don't know. His name was Theodore Judson, or T.J. Jemison. In 1953, he led a successful bus boycott in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It was the first organized action taken by Black people against the segregation laws in the South. 2 years later, on December 1st, 1955, Sister Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and the Dr. Martin Luther King called T.J. Jemison and got tips on how to lead a successful bus boycott. Some consider the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 the start of the Civil Rights Movement. Speaking of buses, I've told the story of Second Lieutenant Roosevelt Robinson of the United States Army, who on July 6, 1944, refused to move to the back of a bus on an Army base in Texas. The Army had passed the law that buses on the base were no longer segregated, but the white driver called the authorities, and Lieutenant Robinson was court-martialed. But he stood his ground, he fought for his rights, and eventually he was found not guilty of all charges. Of course, Lieutenant Robinson went on to become the brother we know as Jackie Robinson, and integrated Major League Baseball, becoming the first Black man to play baseball, Major League Baseball in this country. And today, his number 42 is retired throughout baseball. And on Jackie Robinson Day every year, every ball player in the major leagues wears Jackie Robinson's number 42. And this is our 42nd anniversary. That's our 42nd year, we'll say. I also recently told a story that I told the story of these four brothers. They were giants who have a statue built to them in Greensboro, North Carolina. They were Ezell Blair Jr., today known as Jabril Kazan, Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond, who is now an ancestor. And back in February 1st, 1960, they walked into this woolwork in Greensboro, North Carolina, which had a segregated lunch counter. And they did this. They sat down at that lunch counter and they refused to move until they were serviced. Of course, they weren't serviced, and they came back the next day and the next day and the next day. And before long, there were sit-in movements all across the South. You know, people challenging segregation and trying to integrate lunch counters. These brothers, as I said, were giants, and I got to stand with the giants a few years ago. I also told a story that started with the lynching of Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith. This lynching led to a poem, which led to the song Strange Fruit, which became Billie Holiday's signature song. Billie Holiday was persecuted by the FBI because she wouldn't stop singing that song. And on July the 6th, 1950, she was in the hospital and the FBI refused to let her be treated for her illness, and she died. The FBI is responsible for the death of Billie Holiday. I also went to Ghana with Mama Darnisha and came back with a tribute on the Honorable Asajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who was the president of the first independent nation in Africa. He led his nation to independence. I went to visit his memorial, and my brother and I, and it was an honor to do Asajifo. I've also done stories on what I consider what would be the equivalent of my Mount Rushmore. Four brothers who were all assassinated. One was Malcolm X. Of course, there was Martin Luther King. There was Medgar Evers. And there, of course, is Fred Hampton. That is the equivalent of my Mount Rushmore. All my stories haven't been serious stories. There's some fun stories. Like this brother was the first man, not the first Black man, the first man to walk on the North Pole. Of course, his name was Matthew Henson. And some of you will ask why I would have this picture in when I'm doing a story about Black people, you know. But when I did the tribute, as soon as this picture came up, Minister Imhotep yelled out, "Bass Reeves." Of course, he knew, like I like the story I told, that Bass Reeves was a lawman, mainly in Oklahoma, and was the inspiration for the character of the Lone Ranger. Ah, didn't know that, did you? Okay. I remember one time I was in an airport and I was looking for a book to read, and I kept looking at this face. This face kept calling me back to it. So I was on my way to DC. I picked up another book to read that I was going to read, for a fun book to read while I was in DC. But also I got this book and I thought, when I get back to Oakland, I'll read this book. Well, the book that I bought was no good. I stopped it after 2 chapters. And so I picked up Barracoon and started reading it. And it was the story of Cujo Lewis, who was actually the last, who was captured in Benin, Africa in January of 1835, and who was on that was after slavery had been, after the transport of slaves had been outlawed. He was on that very last ship that brought slaves to America. And he was the last surviving person on that ship. So he was the last brother born in Africa, sold into slavery, and became free. Anyway, it was a fascinating story, and it was written by Sister Zora Neale Hurston. But so that's so much for stories I've told. Now it's time to tell today's historical tribute. In the time that I have left, I'm going to cover a brother whose face you may not know, whose name you may not recognize, but I'm sure that all of you, or at least most of you, know his work, know some of his work. He was born in Pittsburgh as the fourth of 6 children to Daisy Wilson on April 27th, 1945. He was born in April, so of course his mother named him August Wilson. August Wilson is the most renowned African-American playwright in the history of this country. As I said, we may not know his face or his name, but I know that you know his work. He's best known for a series of 10 plays that were collectively called the Pittsburgh Cycle or the Century Cycle, which chronicle the experiences and the heritage of the African American community in the 20th century. These works include his play Fences, and Fences won a Pulitzer Prize for drama and was made into a movie that starred Denzel Washington and Viola Davis. Another of his works was The Piano Lesson. It also won a Pulitzer Prize, and it was made into a movie that starred Charles Dutton and Alfred Woodard. Another work of his that some of us recently saw was called Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, and it was made into a movie that starred Viola Davis and the brother who's now an ancestor, Chadwick Boseman, who we will always remember as Black Panther. As I said, Brother August Wilson wrote 10 plays, wrote a series of 10 plays, and each of the plays was set in a time in the 20th century. There was a play in 1900, and there was one for every decade, right? And this is a list of the plays that he wrote and the decades that it was written in, that it was based in. Altogether, the brother wrote 18 plays. And he died, I have that date here. He died of liver cancer in October 5th, 2005. I just saw a play of his called How I Learned What I Learned. And it is perhaps his best play. It is the only play that he himself ever performed in, and it's about his life story. And so before I sit down, there is one other brother that I do want to mention. I did go to the movies the other night, and I saw a movie about this brother. His name was Ensign Jesse Brown. The name of the movie is Devotion. This brother was the first African-American pilot in the U.S. Navy. The story that I saw, Devotion, talks about his struggle against racism, his manhood, and is a very good story. Sometimes when we go to the movies, we get upset because the movie isn't based in fact. I don't know any of the facts about this brother, but I do know it's a very good movie, and I recommend it highly. And so with that, I say, Asante Sana, Thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me to coordinate and to tell stories over the last 10, 15 years. Rose, I appreciate you, and I honor you, and Asante Sana. Anku Jasanet.